Hello and welcome to Louise Singleton Creations. In today's video I'll be using my brand new tabletop mould from Resin along with resin and coffee beans to create a really cool coffee table for my husband's new cafe. If that sounds interesting, stay tuned, get comfy and enjoy the video. The mould I'm using today is the tabletop mould from Resin and it's 16 inches in diameter. Before I began, I drew around it onto some brown paper and just made a template for where I wanted the legs to be attached and where I wanted my coffee beans to be. The idea was that because I'll be screwing the legs into the base, I wanted the coffee beans to cover the places where the legs would be so you wouldn't see the screws. Right, let's get started. The resin I'm using today is from Resin Pro, and I kind of didn't really have a clue how much I was going to need, so I was making it up as I went along. If there wasn't enough, I just kept adding more. And I'm mixing my resin today with this handy resin tool which was sent to me by Istoyo. I hope that I'm pronouncing that properly, but it's really good at mixing the resin, especially for me because I'm having some trouble with my wrist and stirring for a long time really hurts my wrist. So yeah, it works really well, and I thought it might add bubbles into the resin, but it doesn't. It's nice and gentle and it just does the job very quietly and gently without adding any bubbles. So as I said before, this huge silicone mould is from Resin and it comes in a really good box to store it in. So also if you leave it in the box, you can just close it after you've put each layer of resin in to keep all the dust out. So that works out really well too. And I'm going to put my template underneath just so that I've got my guidelines there and I know where to put everything. Right then, so today's table is a coffee table. I'm using real coffee beans. I bought 2 packets and I actually used 1.5 of the packets in the end. And there is a reason why I decided to do this. This mould, I could tell straight away it was going to take a ton of resin, absolutely loads. So I thought if I fill it up as much as I can with coffee beans, I'm going to need far less resin and save myself some money. But at the same time, I know because I've made a few things before with coffee beans that coffee beans look amazing in resin. That texture really does add another dimension to the finished piece and I love it. So I'm just pouring some resin into those areas which I marked out on my template, which I knew I wanted to have my beans in. And as you can see, there's nowhere near enough resin and I did mix some more up. But this first amount of resin that I mixed was just using up some old resin in some bottles that needed finishing. So I just used what was left. And so yeah, I'm just spreading it out, then I'm going to add the beans on the top. I could have mixed the beans into the resin and just poured it in that way, but the reason I did it this way was I thought if I pour the beans onto the resin, there's less chance of having air pockets trapped underneath. That was the reason why I did it this way. But in a moment you'll see me add the next layer where I did mix it with the resin first. But for this first layer I just thought it'd work better that way. And I've sped it right up because it took me ages. I really did faff around with it. I was having so much fun. It was quite relaxing. For the middle section I decided on using copper and interference gold pigments, and they're both from Resin Pro. I could have made like a coffee colour to make it all kind of make more sense, but I've tried mixing a coffee colour in the past without much success. It never looked like coffee, so I thought I'm not going to try making a coffee colour again. I'm just going to make something which will complement the colour of the coffee beans, and I thought the copper worked really well. So I'm just using my handy little mixer again to mix up my pigments, and I will just simply pour them in. I didn't do anything fancy, not really, just made it up as I went along, as I usually do. And the resin on the coffee beans is, I've only just poured this. This isn't ahead of time or anything. So that's all still runny, and hopefully the clear resin and the coloured resin will kind of blend together, and that movement will work some magic in the resin. Once the resin was all in, I moved the beans around a bit more because it was still moving. All that resin that I'd put with the beans was still moving around, so I was getting some bare patches, which didn't matter, but I thought I'd fill it in a bit. And yeah, once all the beans were in the right position, I moved around the coloured resin a little bit. I did a little bit of swiping with that yellow spreader tool thing, and I just spread the copper over the top of the interference gold to help mix it around a little bit. I didn't do too much, I didn't bother trying to get it perfect, because I knew as soon as I closed that lid and left it to cure, all the movement that's going on in there would cause it to completely transform anyway. And I knew it would be a complete surprise how it would look when I opened the lid again. Okay, here it's the next day and the resin's cured, and I just wanted to do a little bit of a close-up to show you some of the patterns which had formed in the resin as it was all that clear resin was moving from the coffee bean area into the coloured area. That movement has caused some really beautiful patterns in there, and I'm really happy with it. I quite like the way some of the gold pigment from the interference gold mica powder has risen to the top and all settled in the middle to form that gold line. I do quite like that. So yeah, it looks completely different to how it did when I closed the box, doesn't it? Right then, so the next thing I'm going to do is add some more coffee beans, and this time I'm just adding it with a little bit of resin, so I've got a big stodgy mass of coffee beans, because all I want to do is to be able to almost sculpt it into place to bring it up higher. And so I used a thick resin for this. You don't have to if you haven't got any thick resin, but I did. I had some Art Pro Deluxe from Resin Pro, and it stays in position a lot better because it's so thick. But you could just use whatever resin you have. I just didn't want the clear resin, trickling into that middle section. I wanted it to all keep in place. And yeah, so I was being very careful not to bring it up too high because I didn't want coffee beans sticking out the surface of my finished tabletop. So yeah, I was being very careful and just adding more and more to try and get that height right up to the top. The next day, when all the coffee was in position and set and I knew it wasn't going to move, I added another layer of resin, and this time it's just clear. And I'm going to repeat this process until I reach the top. I don't want to pour it too deep all in one go because I'm trying to think. I don't know if it's 2 centimetre maximum pour depth with this resin. It's the transparent resin. And I didn't want to go too deep for it, it could have overheated or had trouble releasing the bubbles. So yeah, I'm just doing it a little bit at a time and being really patient because I don't want to spoil my tabletop. So much resin is going into it. I don't want to make any silly decisions and take any risks. So yeah, I'm going to keep repeating the process, adding more resin until it reaches the top, but I'm not going to show you all of that because it would just be the same thing again and again. Okay, so the last bit of speaking you just heard was before I did this. I said I wasn't going to make any silly decisions, didn't I? Well, the first silly decision was to do my last layer at night when I was about to go to bed. The second decision was to use a very thick resin, which is a good decision, but it was too cold. I didn't warm it up first. And as I was applying it, I thought, it's okay. I'll just use my heat gun and get rid of the bubbles, because this resin, Art Pro Deluxe, is really good for top coats because it's really thick and then it's really strong when it's cured. But because it's so thick, when it comes out of the bottle, it can be very bubbly, and that's why it looks so cloudy now. It's really bubbly. And that's normally fine. I just use my heat gun, get rid of the bubbles, and everything's fine. But I struggled with this for some reason. I think what happened was another bad decision was pouring it too thick. It just couldn't release all the bubbles. So this last layer kind of spoiled it for me. It was a bit cloudy. It turned out okay in the end, but you know, I know the mistake was there and I see it every time I look at it. It's just a little bit cloudy. So, yeah, that was kind of a shame. It's not the fault of the resin. Art Pro Deluxe is a really good resin. It's just my fault for not warming up part A for long enough before doing it. I think it was a bit cold, and if it's too cold, it will be very bubbly. And for not keeping on checking it because I went to bed. That was my other mistake. Don't do something like this late at night when you're about to go to bed and you can't keep your eye on it. Anyway, let's see what happened next. Right, once the problem layer was cured, the next day I decided to take it out of the mould and turn it over and drill the pilot holes for the legs. And I decided to do that because I'd also decided to sand the top with my electric sander and give it one last coat. And I thought, if I turn it over now to do the pilot holes, then I don't need to worry about, you know, causing any dints or anything by putting that pressure on it. I didn't want to damage the top of the finished piece. I'd rather do the drilling and all of that before I do the final coat. So that's what I'm going to do now. So this super mould from Let's Resin comes with 3 foldable hairpin legs, and they're really, really good. I love the fact that it can be folded because this has got to be taken into the cafe where it's going to be, and so it will go into the car much easier with the legs folded down. And also the legs come off of the main bit, you know, the bit that attaches to the table. The legs come off, so it's nice and easy to attach them to the table. So all I'm doing is taking the leg off. You just squeeze it and it comes out, and then I'm going to mark the position for all my pilot holes on the back of the tabletop. The only thing is I didn't quite plan it as well as I thought I had done, and there were some places that would be in that shallow bit in the middle, you know, where there's just the cream bit, which wasn't as deep, and I didn't want to drill into that bit. So in the end I did have to miss out 1 or 2 screws where it would have just come through that creamy white bit. Anyway, I'm just going to use a spacer, which I just found something that was the right size to have it the right distance from the edge, and I used that spacer each time I wanted to position that bracket. Next, I just used a small drill bit in my electric drill and drilled shallow holes in all those spots. Once all that was done, I took it outside and I sanded the other side with my electric sander, ready for the final layer and for the logo which I needed to add. So the good news is my husband, who is a chef at a cafe, is actually taking over the business at that cafe, which is very exciting. And so because my husband is going to be a cafe owner and I'm the artistic wife of the cafe owner, guess what I'm going to be doing? Yes, I'm going to be making lots of products for the cafe with the branding for that cafe on it. Now, it's a cycling cafe. And the branding for the cycling cafe is the colours of the UCI flag. And so, yeah, there's 5 different coloured stripes, and I'm using some, what's it called? I think it's kind of like electrical tape that I got. It's just a vinyl tape. I do have some sheets of vinyl, but I didn't have all the colours, and the ones I did have weren't big enough anyway. So I just got the vinyl tape and I'm sticking that on to put the branding for the cafe on. Once all the stripes were in place, it was time to add the cafe logo. I've got a circle here which is just blank, and I'm just using it as a template to cut out the bits of tape which I don't need, so when I put the logo on it will be flush with the tape. And for the logo I've used my Cricut machine, and yes, that's all I did really. I made it on the Cricut and it's ready to put on. I absolutely love my Cricut machine and never knew I needed one until my friend, actually one of my patrons, was selling one and I bought it from her. And yeah, until then I didn't even think I wanted one, and I got it, and honestly I use it for so many different things now, and now that we've got the cafe as well I can see me using it even more, and it worked perfectly for this. I'm really pleased with how that turned out. Once the branding was on, it was time to add that final layer, and I used the same resin again because, like I said, the problem I had before wasn't the resin. This resin will still be my first choice for a top layer because it's so hard wearing, and that's why I chose it. But this time I've heated it up, the part A up much better and for longer, and I'm spreading it out thinly. I'm not doing a thick coat. And as you can see, it still looks bubbly and cloudy. That's fine. I was still confident that I would get rid of those bubbles with my heat gun. So I poured a little bit on and spread it all out with my spreader, and that was it really. I teased it to the edges so that it didn't overflow. You don't want it dripping down the edges at this stage. Just treat it very gently, and then I used my heat gun and it was ready. Well, it would be ready once it had cured. The next day I screwed the legs into place. Now the thing is, you don't have to do it like this. If you were filling your mould so that the top, as you're filling it, is actually going to be the bottom, if you know what I mean. When you do your final layer, you can actually put the brackets into the resin and set them into place with the resin, and you wouldn't need to screw them in. And that's what Let's Resin recommend in their instructions. But because when I was filling mine, the top, as I saw it as I was filling it, was going to be the top, if that makes sense. I couldn't do it that way. I had to screw them in the bottom. But yeah, that is an option that would be a lot easier if you were doing it that way. Okay, so it's finished, and I've tried my best to take some photographs for you, but it's so shiny. I'm just getting reflections of everything in the room in the tabletop, but hopefully you can get a good idea of how it looks. It's just a shame about that mistake that I made with the final layer, but other than that, I think it still looks good. And as you can see, there's a little sugar pot on there which I made. I was experimenting with nature resin to make that sugar pot, and I haven't quite perfected the process yet, but I am happy with it. So what do you think? Do you like it? Despite the problems I had, it turned out okay, didn't it? And if you would like to purchase the mould from Let's Resin, just have a look in the video description and you'll find the link along with the discount code. And also there'll be discount codes for all the resins that I've used and the pigments from Resin Pro. So we've reached the end of the video. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you haven't already subscribed and you would like to do so, that would be really wonderful. And I will see you again next week. Bye for now.